Science is supposed to make life easier and better, but sometimes it takes a sharp turn into the nightmare zone. Over the years, researchers, some brilliant, some downright reckless, have conducted experiments so disturbing that they sound like a plot from some kind of scary movie. And no, we're not talking about minor lab accidents or oops, mixed the wrong chemicals moments. We're talking about full-scale catastrophes, experiments that crossed ethical lines, defied common sense, and ended in destruction, chaos, or worse. From twisted psychological trials that broke people's minds to military projects so dangerous they should have never been greenlit, these 15 experiments prove that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Some of these will leave you questioning what else has been buried in classified files. Number 15, the hurricane seeding experiment. In 1947, scientists thought they could tame hurricanes. The idea? Well, fly into a storm and dump tons of dry ice into its core to weaken it. Because obviously, manipulating a force of nature with a little ice seemed reasonable. Enter Project Cirrus, a government-backed experiment led by General Electric Labs. When Hurricane King formed off the Florida coast, they saw their chance. Bombers swooped in, releasing dry ice, and at first, it looked like a success. The storm vanished. Then, it came back, and it was angry. Instead of dissipating, the hurricane changed direction, a move meteorologists hadn't predicted, and slammed straight into Savannah, Georgia. The storm caused $2 million in damages, a massive amount at the time, and killed one person. The public was furious, blaming the experiment for turning a bad storm into a catastrophe. Scientists insisted it was just a coincidence, but the damage was done. Number 14. The Monster Study. Being an orphan during the Great Depression was hard enough, but for 22 children in Iowa, it became a psychological nightmare when a researcher decided to use them as guinea pigs in one of the most unethical speech experiments ever conducted. In 1939, speech therapist Mary Tudor Jacobs wanted to prove that stuttering wasn't genetic. It was a learned behavior. To test her theory, she split the children into two groups. One group received positive reinforcement, praise, encouragement, and support. The other, pure cruelty. They were constantly criticized, belittled, and told they'd never speak properly. The results? Heartbreaking. Kids who had never stuttered before developed severe speech disorders. Some became so anxious they stopped speaking entirely. The trauma followed them for life. The study was buried, and Jacobs later admitted she regretted it. But that did nothing to undo the damage. Science is supposed to help people, not destroy them. This wasn't research. This was child abuse. What do you say, guys? Number 13, Unit 731. Some experiments are unethical. This one was outright monstrous. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 conducted human experiments so horrific they rivaled the worst war crimes in history. But here's the truly sickening part. Many of the scientists responsible were never punished. Led by General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 was a secret biological warfare program that used Chinese prisoners as test subjects. Tests included live dissections without anesthesia, amputations to study blood loss, and intentionally infecting people with diseases like cholera and the plague to track how fast they'd die. Some prisoners were frozen alive, others were subjected to chemical weapon attacks. The suffering was unimaginable. And then, the US government granted the scientists immunity in exchange for their research data. Many of them went on to lead successful careers in medicine and business. Well, it was super scary. Number 12, the monkey gland transplant. It's the 1920s, and aging men everywhere are desperate for a fountain of youth. Enter Sergei Abramovich Voronov, a doctor with a creative idea. His solution? Transplanting monkey testicles into human men, because that sounds like a great idea. Wealthy elites, Politicians, royalty, even scientists who should have known better lined up for the procedure, convinced that monkey glands would rejuvenate them. Over 500 men underwent the surgery. Some swore they felt more youthful, but in reality, most just suffered severe infections, organ rejection, and, unsurprisingly, zero actual benefits. Voronov became a celebrity. His pseudoscience inspired copycat rejuvenation procedures across Europe and America. But when it became clear that the whole thing was nonsense, his reputation crumbled. Today, his work is a joke, a reminder of how far people will go to avoid aging. Turns out, the only real cure for getting old is getting old. Number 11. The man who gave Thomas Edison X-ray vision. X-rays revolutionized medicine, but their discovery came at a pretty horrifying cost: one man's life. Meet Clarence Daly, an assistant to Thomas Edison in the 1890s. He was one of the first people to be repeatedly exposed to high doses of radiation, all in the name of perfecting X-ray technology. At the time, no one really understood the dangers. Daly would hold his bare hands under X-ray machines for hours every day, completely unaware that he was slowly cooking himself from the inside out. Then, the symptoms started. Sores, blackened skin, hair loss. His fingers began to rot. Amputation after amputation followed. First his fingers, then his entire left arm, then his right. But the damage was too deep. At just 39 years old, he died from radiation poisoning. The tragedy shook Edison. He later admitted, "Don't talk to me about X-rays. I'm afraid of them." Too little, too late, but at least he finally learned the lesson. Radiation is deadly. Number 10. High-dose radiation tests on prisoners. When it comes to unethical science, this one is straight up horrifying. In the 1960s and 70s, U.S. researchers treated prisoners like disposable lab rats, exposing them to dangerous levels of radiation, all in the name of science. The goal? To see how much radiation it would take to make them sterile. Because astronauts and atomic workers needed data, and who better to experiment on than inmates with no real power to say no? Inmates in Washington and Oregon were given a pathetic $5 a month to participate, with a $100 bonus if they agreed to a forced vasectomy. Meanwhile, their testicles were blasted with 400 rads of radiation, the equivalent of 2,400 chest X-rays. No warnings, no informed consent, just suffering. Many endured severe burns, lifelong illnesses, and irreversible sterility. The U.S. government later admitted it was inhumane, but let's be honest, an apology decades later means nothing to the victims who suffered for research. Number 9. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiment. Imagine going to a doctor for help, only to learn they were the ones who made you sick. That's exactly what happened in the 1940s when U.S. researchers deliberately infected more than 5,500 Guatemalans with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other STIs, without their consent. Why? To see if penicillin could cure sexually transmitted diseases in soldiers. Victims included prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even children. Some were forced into the study, others were tricked, given tainted medicine, or told they were receiving routine care. Many never got treatment at all, suffering painful symptoms, lifelong complications, and, in some cases, death. For decades, this horrifying experiment was buried, until 2010, when the U.S. government finally admitted to it. President Obama issued a formal apology, but no amount of regret could undo the suffering. This wasn't medicine, this wasn't research, this was pure exploitation, one of the darkest moments in American medical history, proving that science without ethics is just sanctioned cruelty. Number 8. The gender experiment. Science should never play God, But someone forgot to tell psychologist John Money. His disturbing gender experiment on a baby named Bruce Reimer is one of the most tragic cases in medical history. In 1965, Bruce suffered a botched circumcision that left him permanently damaged. Enter John Money, who saw this as a perfect opportunity to prove his radical theory. Gender identity is entirely a social construct. His solution? Raise Bruce as a girl. He convinced Bruce's devastated parents to rename him Brenda, undergo surgical reassignment, and raise him as female, claiming he'd grow up perfectly normal. But biology isn't that easy to rewrite. Brenda never identified as female. She hated dresses, rejected her new identity, and suffered from crippling depression. At 14, she learned the truth and transitioned back to male, renaming himself David. But the psychological scars ran deep. At just 38 years old, David took his own life. John Money called the experiment a success. The rest of the world saw it as horrifying. Number 7. The LSD elephant experiment. No, this isn't the name of an underground punk band. It's the true story of scientists who thought the best way to study elephant aggression was to get one insanely high on LSD. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. In 1962, researchers were studying must, a period of extreme aggression in male elephants. Instead of observing it naturally, they decided to force it by injecting an elephant with acid. Their test subject? Tusko, a 14-year-old Indian elephant. But here's the kicker. Instead of a mild dose, they gave him 25 times the known human limit of LSD. Within seconds, Tusko collapsed, experiencing violent seizures. Panicked, the researchers tried to fix their mistake by pumping him full of barbiturates, one of which is literally used in lethal injections. Tusko died almost instantly. Some experiments push the boundaries of knowledge. Others are just reckless stupidity in a lab coat. This one? It's the scientific equivalent of hold my beer. Number 6. The drug trial that turned into a horror show. Signing up for a drug trial seems like an easy paycheck until you end up fighting for your life. That's exactly what happened in 2006 when 6 young men in London agreed to test a new drug called TGN-1412 designed to treat autoimmune diseases and leukemia. What they didn't sign up for was their bodies going into full-blown meltdown minutes after the injection. At first, it was nausea. Then came unbearable pain, violent chills, and swelling so extreme their heads ballooned beyond recognition. The media later called it the Elephant Man trial. Every single one of them ended up in intensive care, their organs failing, their blood clotting, their bodies wrecked by an immune system gone haywire. One man lost his fingers and toes. Others suffered lifelong damage. The kicker? This drug had already been tested on monkeys with no issues. Turns out science is a lot less predictable than we'd like to think. Now let's talk about Number 5. Stubbins Firth and the yellow fever experiment. Some scientists push the boundaries of knowledge. Stubbins Firth, a 19th century medical student, just pushed the limits of human disgust. He was convinced that yellow fever wasn't contagious, and instead of conducting logical, well-planned studies, he decided to go full mad scientist. On himself. His method? Smearing infected vomit into open wounds on his arm. When that didn't make him sick, he rubbed it into his eyes, inhaled the fumes, and, because he clearly hadn't hit peak insanity, he straight up drank it. Yes, he willingly swallowed infected puke for science. And when he still didn't fall ill, he declared victory. Yellow fever wasn't contagious. Except, it was. He just got lucky because the real culprit, mosquitoes, wasn't in the mix. So, after bathing in, inhaling, and drinking human bile, what did he accomplish? Well, absolutely nothing. Except maybe proving that some experiments are just gross for the sake of being gross. Number 4. The baby chimp experiment. In 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg had a wild idea. What if a chimp was raised like a human? Could it learn to walk, talk, and think like us? To test this, he brought home a baby chimp named Gua and raised her alongside his own infant son, Donald. At first, the results were fascinating. Gua mimicked human behavior, learned commands, and even outperformed Donald in problem-solving tasks. But then, things got weird. Instead of Gua becoming more human, Donald started acting more like a chimp. He grunted instead of speaking, crawled instead of walking, and even bit people. Kellogg, realizing he might be rewiring his son's brain, abruptly ended the experiment and sent Gua away. But the damage was done. Donald, having spent crucial developmental years with a chimp sibling, continued exhibiting animal-like behaviors. The study was supposed to explore nature versus nurture, but it ended up proving something far darker. Number 3. The world's first see-through frog. If you thought glow-in-the-dark fish were strange, meet Japan's see-through frogs, a real-life sci-fi experiment that made amphibians transparent. The goal? Allows scientists to observe organ function in real time without dissection. The result? Frogs that could literally see their own hearts beating. Created by researchers at Hiroshima University, these frogs had genetically engineered glass-like skin, making their organs visible. Scientists hoped this would revolutionize medical research, particularly in cancer studies. But while it seemed like a step toward more humane science, it quickly became an ethical nightmare. The frogs still endured painful experiments, drug testing, and genetic mutations. The only difference? They were fully aware of everything happening to them. Animal testing has always been controversial, and while this experiment avoided traditional dissection, it didn't spare the frogs from suffering. Number 2. The Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, millions of people gathered around their TVs to watch history unfold. NASA's Challenger space shuttle was about to launch, carrying Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian astronaut, a teacher chosen to inspire students worldwide. But just 73 seconds after takeoff, excitement turned to horror. The shuttle exploded in mid-air, killing all 7 crew members in front of a stunned world. The cause? A tiny faulty rubber O-ring in one of the solid rocket boosters. NASA's engineers knew it was a problem. They warned that cold weather could make the O-ring fail, but under pressure to keep the launch schedule, officials ignored the warnings. And just like that, 7 lives were lost in a catastrophe that never should have happened. The world was left grieving. NASA spent 2 years trying to fix its mistakes. But for the families of the crew, no investigation or policy change could undo what had been done. Number 1. The Milgram shock experiment. Would you electrocute a stranger if someone in a lab coat told you to? Turns out most people would. In 1963, psychologist Stanley Milgram set out to test how far people would go under authorities' influence. The results? Downright terrifying. Volunteers were told they were part of a study on memory and learning. Their job? Administer electric shocks to a learner every time they get an answer wrong. The shocks weren't real, but the volunteers didn't know that. As the fake shocks increased in intensity, the learner, an actor, screamed in agony, begged for mercy, and eventually went silent, suggesting they had passed out or even died. But when the scientist in charge simply said, "The experiment must continue," most participants kept going. A staggering 65% of people followed orders all the way up to 450 volts, enough to kill. Milgram's experiment proved a chilling truth. Ordinary people will commit horrific acts if told to by an authority figure. If you found this video interesting, be sure to smack that like, share, and subscribe button for more content like this. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.